The following audio is from the Paradox Church in Fort Worth, Texas. To support the mission of the Paradox Church, text your amount to 84321 or visit us online at theparadoxchurch.com/give.
All right. Nice work, man. I feel like you maybe lowered your voice a little bit more than normal, but I feel it. My name is Jim, one of the pastors here. It's good to have you. Good morning. Before we get started, I did want to bring up, I wanted to mention something, just explain some things for you, in particular for the families. This isn't as big of a deal at the 11, but we've been turning lots of kiddos away week after week, and that's been really hard. So I think we turned away 40 kiddos from the kids ministry last week, just out of space. And so we just wanted to acknowledge that we know that's happening, and we care about that, and we recognize that that's not ideal. That you get up and get your kids in the car, and that's not easy in and of itself. And then come and are not able to get into a room because it's full. And we want to be more hospitable than that. We also don't exactly know what to do because rooms just get full. So we know we're trying to work towards it. Some things that we're thinking about, a third service, praying through even buying this building next door and opening up some more classrooms, things like that. And so we're on it. Okay, we're on it, and we're trying to figure what that looks like. Figure out what that looks like as fast as we can. But for now, I just want to acknowledge, hey, we get it. We're sorry that's sometimes your experience. I would say that any of the solutions that we would come up with, or even a combination of solutions, is going to involve two things: people and money. And so if you've been around for a little while but haven't yet connected, haven't yet partnered with us, I would just encourage you in that. If you are resonating with what God's doing here, and you want to call this church your home, I would just say, encourage you to jump in and help out with that. But we're just going to keep going, because after this sermon, it's possible that there's going to be a lot more kids in like 9 months. And so y'all gonna have to laugh today, because this is I gotta preach this. I'm gonna need y'all's help. All right, so you with me? Here's what we do. We typically just grab a book of the Bible and teach through it, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. So, for example, I think when we're done with this series, we're gonna walk through the book of Nehemiah. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to start the year looking at this topic of wisdom. That there are questions of morality, right and wrong, but then there's also questions of wisdom. What is wise or what is foolish? And church folk, we have a tendency to look to Jesus and the church and the Bible for questions of morality, but we don't tend to go to Jesus for questions of wisdom, guidance. We look to the world for that. We tend to look to the experts, read the book, watch the YouTube video, what are best practices, and that's how we typically think of that. And what's the problem with that, or a few problems with that, is that most of life is a question of wisdom. Most of life is not a question of morality. Morality is pretty easy. Most of the time during the day, the decisions you're making are not between right and wrong. You know what is right, what is wrong. Not that you always do it, but at least you know. But we have many, many questions about wisdom throughout the day. What would be wise here? What would be foolish here? And so Jesus actually offers us wisdom. The Bible, in the middle of the Bible, actually has 5 books called the wisdom literature. And so Job and Psalms and Proverbs and the Song of Songs and the book of Ecclesiastes, they're written by God, given to us to help us in matters of wisdom. And so we've talked about a lot of different ideas: mental health. How do we have wisdom around our mental health? And we've talked about biblical masculinity or biblical femininity. And so we also wanted to hit on this very, very real topic and necessary for wisdom, the topic of sexual intimacy. And so wisdom and sex. The wisdom of the world in regards to sex and sexual activity is that sex is for self-empowerment. That basically we have biological functions and desires, we have urges and needs, and there's even an empowerment that you can have, an expression of yourself you can have, and that's what sex is for. And so the world says, hey, this is about you. Sex becomes basically about you. It's for you. It's essentially your thing, and not so much about the other person, but about you. And that's been the message since the sexual revolution of the 60s. And yet what's interesting is that it hasn't quite worked. Even secular folks are beginning to recognize that the sexual revolution didn't do what they thought it would do. In fact, sexual activity, just by and large, in general, in the world, is actually decreasing, not increasing. Marriage rates have gone down, pornography has gone up, and, quote, fewer Americans are engaging in sexual intercourse. This trend has been observed across different demographics and even different nations. So in the United States, the percentage of high school students who'd had intercourse dropped from 54% to 40% over the course of the last 30 years. The average young adult in 2018 was having 20% more sex than they are now. In Britain, even the Brits are struggling with this, amazingly. The rate, I don't even know what that means. I have no idea. The rate of intercourse among people ages 16 to 44 dropped from more than 6 times a month to fewer than 5 times a month in the last 23 years. In Australia, Australians in relationships went from having sex about 1.8 times a week to now only 1.4 times a week. In Finland, a study found that there is a decline in intercourse frequency corresponding to a rising rate of masturbation. I'll move on. In Sweden, a study found that the Swedes were having less sex. In Japan, a third of Japanese single people ages 18 to 34 were virgins in 2015. That has gone up to 43% in that same age group. This decline of sexual activity actually has sociologists concerned about demographics and even, what do they say, marriage, relationships, and birth rates, that it can cause long-term demographic and fiscal negative implications. And so by and large, just in general, sexual activity has gone down. There's a lot of other kind of antecedent reasons for that. Anxiety, stress, all on the rise corresponds with that as well. But where do people find the most sexual fulfillment? Which demographic says that they have the highest level of sexual fulfillment? Christian marriages. Nancy Percy, she says this: in highly religious couples, wives are twice as likely as their secular peers to say they are satisfied with their sexual relationship, and husbands in these couples are fully 4 times as likely to report being sexually satisfied as men in relationships with no religious activity. Christian marriages, highest rate of sexual fulfillment. So here's what I want to do, okay? There's so much that I could talk about. Y'all had a lot of questions. And I can't answer them all. I wanted to focus us on one aspect of this. I want to talk about the oneness of marriage. The oneness of marriage, the expression. Sex becomes then this expression of the oneness of marriage. We talked last week about emotional intimacy. This week I want to talk about physical intimacy, the one flesh union of Christian marriage. God's good design, God's good gift of Christian sexuality, because the Christian vision for sex is a better story than the one that the world is telling. We have to recapture the sex narrative because it's better. It's better. Everything that God creates, Satan counterfeits, and so God alone has the real thing. And so the story that Christianity tells in regards to sexual intimacy is just better than the one that the world is telling, okay? And so I want to raise our heights, our sights on what God is doing, what he has created in sexual intimacy. And so single folk, unmarried people, obviously this is for you. Let me tell you this, old school purity culture stuff. Like if you were raised in some of that, it had a tendency to possibly, like sometimes, try to scare you into waiting. Right? Scare you, like sex is, it's bad. You could, bad things can happen if you, it's dirty, wrong, and bad. Save it for the one you love, And so they sometimes we tended to scare you into waiting. I want to do the opposite. I want to wow you into waiting. I want you to have such a high view of what God has done in this great gift of sexual intimacy that you're like, oh, I want to do it that way. I want to do it in the way in which God has designed it. So here's what we're going to do. 3 things, really similar to the masculinity and femininity sermon. 3, this is my rubric. I want to talk about the biology of oneness, the biology, the science of oneness, a theology of oneness, and then the redemption of oneness, because oneness is broke. Oneness has been broken in us. And so biology, theology, and redemption. So first, the biology, the science of oneness. Look at chapter 4, verse 1 again. He's singing to his bride. Here's what he says. Behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair, she has goat hair, right? Goat hair, leaping down the slopes of Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing. They're clean. Amen. All of which bear twins, and not one among them has lost its young. She has all her teeth. Very important. Very important. Verse 8, your lips are like a scarlet thread. Your mouth is lovely. Your cheeks, he's just working his way down her body. Your cheeks are like halves of a pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like a tower of David, built in rows of stone. On it hang 1,000 shields, and all of them shields of warriors. Your 2 breasts are like twin fawns, twins of a gazelle that graze among the lilies. Until the day breathes and the shadows flee, I will go away to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. He's doing what in ancient Middle Eastern cultures was called a wasf. It was a poetic literary device where he basically, index your lover's body and kind of connect with it, a metaphor that's a little bit, it's goat hair. You're connecting like parts of the body with, some sort of kind of metaphor. In Renaissance love poetry, it was called an emblematic blazon. So this is a common cultural, it was a thing in their culture that they would do. And he's taking inventory of her body, saying, I like this, and I like that, and I really like that. In fact, he's going to do it 2 more times in the song, and then she's going to do it to him as well. This isn't just a male expression to the wife, but the wife will do it also to her husband. And what's crazy, they would do this at the wedding. They would do this at the wedding. This would be in public, at the wedding, husband and wife, and be like, I like this, and I like that. This was public, right? And so each time that you do it, the descriptions will stop with the object of the speaker's erotic attention. Okay, so that would be the emphasis. Wherever he stops, that's the emphasis, okay? And so he stops at her breasts. Now, he spends the most time there. I counted all the words that he used because I'm a diligent and studious pastor. You pay me for this, okay? So you're getting your money's worth. He uses 38 words about her breasts, and coming in at a distant second place is 30 words to describe her teeth. So breasts and teeth, very important, okay? Very important. Now, if you're surprised to see some of this in the Bible, you shouldn't be. In fact, this is all over the wisdom literature. So Proverbs chapter 5, we've been in Proverbs much of the series. It says this, let your fountain be blessed. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe, let her breast fill you at all times with delight, and be intoxicated always in her love. Be drunk in her love. Right? The Bible is not prude. This is not a prude, word, right? This is God's design, God's gift, and so he's communicating to us with wisdom what it looks like and how we should think about it. And so this celebration of the man, of his wife's sexuality is not unlike God's celebration of his creation in Genesis 1. Right? God was indexing his creation. He's like, sun, moon, man, that's good, I like that. Land and animals and birds and fish. I like that. That's good. And then he gets to man and woman and he says, that's really good. I really, really like that. That's good. And he's delighting in his creation. And so he's doing the same thing here. And the last thing that God created was woman. Right? The very crescendo, the climax of God's creation is woman. And God brings Eve to Adam and he responds in the same way that this man does. He sings to her, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And so this is very godly, very natural in the scriptures to celebrate creation, creative beauty, and even our sexuality. And so then in verse 7, he begins to invite her to be intimate. You are altogether beautiful, my love. There's no flaw in you. Come with me, he says. Verse 9, you have captivated my heart, my sister, my bride. Verse 10, how beautiful is your love. The word love there is the word dode. It's the Hebrew word for erotic love. So he's not talking about, sweet love. He's talking about love, my sister, my bride, how much better is your love than wine? Your lips drip nectar, my bride. He's got some game right here, okay? Jump down to verse 16. So in verse 16, if you notice at the second part of verse 16, the heading says she. They miss this. She actually starts talking right here at the beginning of verse 16. So she starts talking. He's inviting her into intimacy. Now she responds and says, awake, O north wind, and come, and O south wind, blow upon my garden. Let its spices flow. Let my beloved come to his garden and eat its choicest fruits. And so he's inviting her into intimacy. And so one thing I want to point out here, 20 times in this text, both the husband and the wife, the word my, they repeat the word my. Over and over and over, they're saying my. They're speaking of their mutual possession and oneness. So blow upon my garden. I came to my garden. I ate my honeycomb with my honey. Let my beloved come to his garden. Why? Because sex is about unity. It's about oneness. It's about mutual possession and a holy giving of ourselves to the other. Sex is you become a part of me and I become a part of you. It's oneness. And so every sex act is a uniting act. Every sex act is an expression of the oneness of marriage. Wisdom, if you remember, it's founded in God's creation. It's rooted in God's creation. What is wise and what is foolish? Well, how did God create this thing to be? Well, God created marriage to be an expression of oneness, or to be about oneness. The very essence of marriage is oneness. And so sex then is the expression of that oneness. And so this is just a reality. It's also biologically and scientifically true. Okay, so my favorite book this series has been The Female Brain. Here's what she says. She says, during times of physical separation, when touching and caressing is impossible, a deep longing, almost a hunger for the beloved can set in. Some people don't even realize how bonded or in love they are until they feel this tugging at their heartstrings when the beloved is absent. We are used to thinking of this longing as only psychological, but it's actually physical. The brain is virtually in a drug withdrawal state. Once reunion takes place, all the components of the original loving bond can be reestablished by dopamine and oxytocin. Activities such as caressing, kissing, gazing, hugging, and orgasm can replenish the chemical bond of love and trust in the brain. The oxytocin dopamine rush once again suppresses anxiety and skepticism in the relationship and reinforces the love circuits in the brain. Isn't that fascinating? Every sex act is a uniting act. That's how God made us to be. It's how it works. It's how it functions. That's how we were created. You become a part of me and I become a part of you. I'm going to give my whole self to you, not just my physical self, but my relational self, my emotional self, my hormonal self. My whole self is given to you and your whole self is given to me. This is why we've all had the friend where the group of friends are like, why is she with him, right? Like the whole group of friends is like, why is she with him? And the whole group of guy friends are like, why is he with her? Like that is not a good fit for them. And we've all had them. We're like, why is she with him? And why is it? It boggles the mind that they would be together 99 times out of 100 it's because they're sleeping together. And they've been so connected, so bonded, and they are so foolish to know what's happening there that they're with somebody that probably, everybody around them thinks that they shouldn't be with, but there is a union that has been created. And so she goes on in The Female Brain, she says, mothers often warn their daughters, let's show them this one. Mothers often warn their daughters not to get too close too soon with a new boyfriend. This advice may be wiser than they realize. The act of hugging or cuddling releases oxytocin in the brain, especially in females, and likely produces a tendency to trust the hugger. Listen to this. It also increases the likelihood that you will believe everything and anything he tells you. Whoa. Yeah. Why? Well, because sex is always a uniting act. Sexual activity is always a bonding thing. It's happening. Your whole being, your whole person begins to tie together with the other person, right? So the biology of oneness is just sexual activity. It is the expression of that. It actually begins to bond us to one another. Well, what about the theology of oneness? Does the Bible teach the same thing? We'll look at chapter 5, verse 1, the second part of verse 1. Right? He responds to her, but then you have this heading, others, right? Eat, friends, drink, and be drunk with love. What's happening here is typically in the song, the others are her single friends. So throughout the song, a few times they'll sing something. And what's interesting is that this is at the very center of the book. Chapter 5, verse 1, there are 111 lines before this. There are 111 lines in the song after this. So everything is pointing to this very moment where the people respond to their love and they say, yes, eat, right? Drink, be drunk with love. And so many commentators think that this is actually God talking. This is God speaking. This is God giving approval to their sexual intimacy and their expression of oneness. And so whether whether God is directly inserting himself into the song or indirectly he has inspired this in his scriptures, God is giving approval for what they're doing. That this is God's idea, right? So Genesis 2, it ends with this beautiful verse. It says, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. Right? So that this is part of God's good design, that we would be married, and we would be one, and then we would express that oneness. Right? If God creates in Genesis 1 and he says it's good, it's really good, and he's delighting in that, would it be all that hard to imagine him looking down at this couple and saying, yes, I approve of this. This is how I made this to be. This is a good thing. And so God is celebrating their oneness. Now here's what oneness is. Oneness is I give my whole self to you and you give your whole self to me. Right? That's oneness. Your whole being, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, hormonally, in every which way. We're going to have one name, one bank account. We're going to be one family. We're going to go to one church. We're going to have one life, one legacy, because we're one. Right? God took a rib from Adam and he formed Eve, and then in their marriage, they are reunited again. They're one again. And so biblical marriage then is the giving of yourself wholly to the other in every which way, physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, which is why sex outside of marriage then is so destructive. We get that question all the time. It's like, what about sex before marriage? And is it wrong to do this and to do that? Yes, unbelievably so, because it's unbelievably destructive to who you are, who they are, and to what God has done in his good design of sex. Sex outside of marriage is giving yourself physically to another, but not being willing to commit to giving your whole self to them. That's not what sex is. Right? Sex doesn't work that way. It's a uniting act. It's a oneness act. We don't just make love to a body, we make love to the whole person. Dode is a mingling of souls, not a mingling of flesh. And so sex outside of marriage is destructive when you unite yourself to another person without the commitment of that whole one flesh union. So the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, he writes in 1 Corinthians, he says, so flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. He's saying, hey, sexual sin, it's a little bit different because it's a sin against your own body. Now, the Greek word he uses there is soma, okay? And soma doesn't refer to just the physical, just the flesh. There's other words for that. Soma refers to the whole being, right? The whole person. So one theologian, he says this. He says, human beings do not have a soma. We are a soma. I do not have a body. I am a body. My body is not a house or a prison for my real self, my true self. My body is my real self. What I do to my body, I do to me. My body may be my outer self and my soul, my inner self, but both are the same self. And so what the Apostle Paul is saying is that every time we engage in sexual activity, it's with our soma, right? It's with who we are. It's not separate from that. It's not just biology. It's also psychology. It's also theology that's happening in the sexual act. right? It's always going to be about oneness, which is why Paul says, so flee from sexual immorality. Right? Well, what is that? Well, it's the Greek word porneia. It's where we get our word pornography. It's just basically a junk drawer term to refer to any sort of sexual activity outside of marriage, the expression of oneness in marriage. And so it covers everything. Like it's everything. It's anything that is outside of the marriage in regards to sexual activity, right? So it answers the question, like we did this Q&A at the college night last Wednesday, because you always get this question from young Christian people. How far is too far, right? How far is too far? Well, this answers that question. Porneia means no intercourse, right? No intercourse, no outer course. There's no other courses that you're allowed to have. Like there's no coursing outside of the marriage, right? No coursing. I know, but can we cuddle? Can we spoon? No. You can't spoon. You can't fork. You can't knife. You can't toast. You can't blend. I mean, whatever else you do in the kitchen, you can't do until you're married, and then you go into the kitchen. I don't know. But why though? Why does he say flee from sexual immorality? Because sex is bad? No, because of how wonderful it actually is. Because of all that it is, flee, run from any form of it that is outside of the way in which God designed it to be. And so the biology of oneness, but then you also have a theology of oneness. This is how God made sexual intimacy to function. Now, I know, here's the thing. I had all weekend, I was like, I just had in mind like this would be kind of a fun, lighter sermon in Sunday, right? And sometimes you need that. You need some lightness. And so all weekend I was just kind of thinking about that. And anyways, this morning, before you were here, just kind of felt the weight of the room. Just the weight of the room, the weight of the men and women that would walk into this place. And we had a real powerful prayer time, and the Lord met us there. And so here's all I'm trying to say. I know that many of us, we walked in here, and maybe with a little bit of trepidation, knowing the topic if you knew it. But you walked in here, and you get this ideal of marriage. Right? Some people read the Song of Songs as man, that just seems so far from my experience. It seems so far. And it's funny because the world, it gives its own kind of version of sex, and it's the same thing. It seems so everyone seems to be just awesome and sexy, and everything's going great all the time, and movies make it look so great and good and everything. And so in their way of explaining and giving us counsel towards sex, that feels like it's out of reach. But then we get to the Song of Songs and their oneness and their sweetness, this kind of doting desire between this husband and wife. It seems so godly. And it seems so unattainable, this idea of oneness, because the reality is oneness is broken. Oneness is broken because we're broken. And so we have to see the redemption of oneness too. The Song of Songs was not written as an ideal. God was not unaware of the brokenness of his people at this point when he's writing. When this is inspired, he's not hey guys, you're never gonna get this. You're never going to achieve this. No, it's not written as an ideal. It's written as hope of redemption. Hope of redemption. Right, so jump back to verse 7 real quick. Chapter 4, verse 7. Here's what he says. He says, "You are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you." That's good, isn't it? There is no flaw in you. What's interesting is that the wife back in chapter 1 actually confesses that she does have a flaw. She has some body image issues. She's a little uncomfortable in her own skin, and she confesses that to him, and he says, no, there's no flaw in you. There's no flaw. Right? He works his way down her body and eyes and hair and teeth and lips and cheeks and neck and breasts. It's 7 body parts that he recognizes. 7 is the symbol, the numeric symbol for perfection in the Bible. He says there's no flaw in you. So let's chat. The scene, the setting of the Song of Solomon is almost always in a vineyard or a garden. And it's meant to point us back to Genesis 1 and 2, to the first garden, the Garden of Eden. It's meant to make us think back to that moment where Adam and Eve are both naked and what? Not ashamed. They're not ashamed. They're not broken, right? So it's wanting us to look back there, think about that, because ever since then, we find ourselves naked and full of shame. And so right after that moment in Genesis 2 where they're naked and not ashamed, we get to Genesis 3, and that's when sin enters the world. And so sin it's essentially wanting to be our own God. It's wanting to take God's stuff and to operate and walk in them in the way in which we want to do. It's pretty much just like the world teaches us in regards to sex. It's about you. Right? This thing's about me. It's my expression, my authority, what I want to do. That's basically what sin is. We try to be our own God. We go outside of the wisdom of God's creation. We try to find our own way, and that's led to so much destruction in all of our lives, but certainly in regards to our sexual lives as well. And so many of us are so sexually broken that true oneness seems impossible. Right? The song, if it's meant to point us back to the Garden of Eden, we look back there and we think, how could we ever get there? Sin has broken every aspect of our life. It's what it does. It separates. So sin first separated us from God, but it also separates us from one another. Marriage is broken because of sin. Relationships are broken because of sin. And so we look back there and we wonder, how can we find oneness? There is no flaw in you. How does he say that to her? I mean, he knows better, right? He's a man. He knows better to actually tell her there's something wrong with her, but but how does he say there's no flaw in you? Well, this is grace. Because of grace. And the crazy thing is that Jesus says the same thing to us. There is no flaw in you. Jesus, he looks at all of our shame and all of our brokenness and all of our sin. He looks at his bride, the church, and he says, there's no flaw in you. How is that possible? Grace. In Ephesians 5, the Apostle Paul is talking about marriage, but he doesn't really want to talk about marriage. He wants to talk about what marriage points to. And he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, gave his body for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. Why? So that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. And so God sees us in Christ, and he says, there is no flaw in you. Broken? No, there's no flaw in you. Sin? No, there's no flaw in you. Shame? No, there's no flaw in you. See, if the garden imagery in the Song of Songs is meant to point us back to the first garden, the Garden of Eden, it's also meant to point us forward to another garden, to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus, he commits his body to us. Where Jesus, he is resolute in what he's going to do, that he's going to commit the sacrifice of his body for the sins that we've done in our body. Where Jesus commits to break his body for the brokenness that's in our body. Because by his wounds, we will what? Be healed. There's no flaw in you. Church, there's no flaw in you. Jesus looks at you and says, there's no flaw in you. In the gospel, the sexually broken can be sexually restored. In the gospel, the sexually broken can be made righteous. In the gospel, the sexually broken can experience wholeness and oneness in marriage. There is no flaw in you. Just, I think about this. I hope this is not too weird. Where Jesus, remember in Revelation, he stands in the midst of us? That Jesus was here and he would look at us. And he would look at different aspects of who we are. And he would just say, I like that. Man, I love your worship, Paradox. I love it. And I delight in your love for each other. And I Man, the way that you stand to hear the reading of Scripture and your heart warms to my words, I love that. And the way in which you give of yourself, like your money and your time and your energy and your efforts and your prayers, I love. And he just kind of works his way down our body, right? The body of this church, the body of Christ, he works his way down. He just says, I like that. There's no flaw in you. I didn't know how to finish the sermon over the weekend. I was just not really sure where it would go. And I woke up this morning, I almost texted my wife to pray for me. I'm sorry, baby, I forgot. Because I was I don't know how this is supposed to end. What do I do? And so I was praying, and here's what I think the Spirit told me to tell you. Marriage and sex are not everything. They're not everything. You can live a full and flourishing life without it. Jesus did, Paul did. Jesus was the happiest human that ever walked the earth and never married and never had sex. But there is a picture, right, that God has given us that is meant to be the display of God's love for his people. That Jesus' love for the church would be evidence, it would be seen, it would be pictured in the love of a husband and a wife. And so it's monumentally important for the health of this church and our public witness that the marriages of this church would be healthy. And so here's what I think the Lord kind of gave me. I was thinking about this. In Genesis 2, when Adam and Eve are naked and without shame, here was my question. If they didn't feel shame, what did they feel? What would that be like? To not feel shame. Every one of us, to some degree, whether we walk in a low degree of shame in one day or, some of you have loads of shame. What would it be like to not feel shame? What did they feel? What did they feel if they didn't feel shame? No body image issues, not being ever uncomfortable in their own skin, right? Their desires rightly ordered, rightly directed. Never once like good sexual desires, but not distorted sexual desires. They always had that. What was that like? There was nothing broken about them. There was no past sin to haunt them. There was nothing but the presence of God and their pure love for each other. What was that like? To be completely vulnerable, totally naked, emotionally, relationally, and physically, totally known and totally unashamed. What did they feel if they didn't feel shame? Well, they felt oneness. True oneness. Oneness and shame cannot coexist. Oneness and shame cannot coexist in your relationship with God. It's why he feels far from you sometimes. It's why you don't feel worthy. It's why, right? And oneness and shame can't coexist in marriage. At the root of our marriage struggles is shame. Shame, it's this profoundly powerful thing that attacks your very personhood, your very soma, your very soul, your very being. Guilt is different. Let me just give you a little theology lesson. Guilt makes you feel bad, but shame makes you feel like you're bad. You see the difference? Guilt is, I feel bad that I did this. Shame is, you're bad. You're wrong. You're dirty. There's something broken about you. And people don't maybe realize this, but what Jesus was doing was to take away both guilt and shame. See, in the Old Testament, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would take a goat, a lamb, and he would slaughter the goat. He'd place all the sins of God's people on him, right? Symbolically placing the sins of the people on the lamb. And then he would sacrifice this spotless lamb, taking away the sins of God's people. But then there was a second goat, the scapegoat. The scapegoat, same thing. He would lay his hands on the goat, symbolically placing the sins of God's people on the goat, but then he wouldn't kill that goat. He would send, better goat to be, right? He would send that goat out into the wilderness, symbolizing our sins being taken away. that our shame is taken away. Jesus is both our propitiation. He satisfies the guilt, right? The penalty, the price of sin, but he's also our expiation. He cleanses us from sin. Jesus takes away both guilt and shame. And so the enemy loves shame. Right? Shame in marriage, shame in our relationship with God, it hinders our sense of oneness. It robs us of the joys of that relationship. And Satan loves to remind you of all the things that you've done to re-shame you. In 2 Samuel, Tamar, she's assaulted by her half-brother, and she asks a question that we all are essentially asking in our heart: where do I carry my shame? And so here's the hope. Here's the answer for Tamar and the answer for us. We take our shame and we carry it to Jesus. We take it and we lay it at his feet, and we watch him pick it up and put it on his shoulders like a cross too heavy for us to carry. And we watch him despise the shame. In a sense, Jesus mocks the shame. In Hebrews 12, it says, with the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despised the shame, and now he sits in triumph at the right hand of the Father. Jesus sits in triumph at the right hand of the Father, daily inviting you to share in his victory. Here's something I've been wanting you to get, I think, for the last 3 or 4 years. Jesus is already done with your sin. He's already dealt with your sin. For whatever reason, you're still worried about it. He's already taken care of that. Right? So much of the problems in relationships, marriage, in life is us putting this burden of how we feel and who we are on the other person, and Jesus has already done this. And so he's already dealt with your sin. Your sin is gone. No more. And so the rest of your life, all he is doing is trying to invite you into walk in his victory. Right? Like the battlefield of your life has been won. Like the war has been won, but there's just a bunch of crap left over. And so he's walking with you and he's picking things up and he's saying, that's mine now, and here's how you do this. And so there's just kind of this mess of the war of your life, and Jesus just keeps walking with you and just inviting you into more of his victory. And so there's so much hope, there's so much hope, there's so much hope. The Song of Solomon is not this ideal that you will never attain. Oneness is possible. Between you and God, it is certain. Between you and your spouse, every day, more and more, as we look at one another and we say, there is no flaw in you. I have so much grace for you. As we look to Jesus together and Jesus says to us, there is no flaw in you. I have so much grace for you. We walk more and more in the victory of the redemption of God's oneness between us and him and between one another. There's so much hope. God, there's so much hope. And so I just pray, Lord, that you would bring healing in this place. I pray that you would silence the voice of the enemy who says this is how it will always be. Because of what you did, this is how it will always be. Because of who you are, this is how it will always be. God, would you silence the words of the enemy who lies and attacks and condemns us? Would we hear loud the voice of Jesus who says, no, this is how it will always be. There is no flaw in you. This is what it will always be. You have victory in me. Oneness is certain. In the marriage of the church with Jesus, oneness is certain. Our union is secure. Bought with blood, a broken body, given for us. This is how it will always be, united to Christ. There's no flaw in you.